Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be focusing on Chapter 4, all about listening and relationship development. Most people know a good listener when they meet one, so this chapter is going to analyze some of the skills and mechanisms of effective attending and listening skills. So by the end of this chapter, you will be able to explain the difference between therapist skills and therapist attitudes, adopt a therapeutic attitude in your work with clients, organize your listening behaviors into 3 categories, list and apply non-directive listening behaviors into your clinical interviews, and modify your listening skills to fit male and female clients and clients from different cultural backgrounds. So what are listening skills? Listening skills are sometimes called facilitation skills or micro skills. When we think about listening skills in and of itself, something for us to think about or something for us to remember is that listening skills are some of the skills that are the backbones of building therapeutic rapport. And when we think about listening skills, it's the ability to accurately receive and interpret messages in the communication process. When you think about these skills, remember that there's multiple. So it's all about making sure that you have the ability to be present with your clients and to be able to be as present as possible and truly hear what someone is saying. When we think about Carl Rogers, he didn't refer to these as skills. He referred to these as essentially the backbone or the full meaning behind what it is that we need to do. He said that there are so few ways to truly connect with someone, more so than there is to be able to listen. And to be effective, active listening must be firmly grounded in the basic attitudes of the user. We can't employ this as a technique if our fundamental attitudes are in conflict with its basic concepts. If we try, our behavior will be empty and sterile, and our associates will be quick to recognize this. Until we can demonstrate a spirit which genuinely respects the potential worth of the individual, which considers their sights and trusts their capacity for self-direction, we can't begin to be effective listeners. So essentially, effective listeners begin with us. And part of these skills is all about us having the ability to grow and attain said skills. He believed that that attitude was so important in the therapeutic change, but again, it's an attitude that we need to work on and hone, and the skills behind that attitude so that we can then employ the ability to actively listen to our clients. When we think about adopting a therapeutic attitude, there is a couple of things that we need to think about. First of all, we need to think about neurogenesis and listening with empathy. So neurogenesis is essentially the growth and development of nervous tissue, and how that happens is by developing new skills. So in order for us to listen with empathy, and empathy, for those of you who are unaware, is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So in order for us to be able to develop this tissue and learn and listen with empathy, it takes practice. So you can get that knowledge base, but you have to continue to apply it. Carl Rogers also believed that communication is a two-way street, and it is. When you think about conversations that you have with people, something that is so basic as listening is often something that is the hardest to achieve. Being able to listen and then effectively respond is a skill that very few people actually develop in their lifetime. Far too often, we become wrapped up in what is our next statement going to be? How are we going to respond next based on a few key words? So we get lost in the what should our next response be versus being fully present and listening and then pausing to then respond. We also have to have attending behavior. When we think about attending behavior, we think of a couple of things. So in our sessions, we essentially want to be not only as present as possible, but we also want to make sure that our body language is congruent with how we are listening. So the way that we express ourselves, the way in which we have our eyes open, we have an interested posture, we're maintaining eye contact, and we are exhibiting a neutral or validating type of expression or an interested type of expression can be really important in again, having that relationship, that communication, and building that rapport with our client. When we think about non-directive listening, in many ways, we tie in directive and non-directive together because you can't really have one without the other. Think of it as making a cake. If you forget to put in certain ingredients, your cake is not going to turn out the way that you intended. So you have to make sure that you use all of your ingredients in order to mix them and bake them and have this delicious cake. When you think about non-directive and directive, they are very much, they go hand in hand, and you need both of them in order to have not only a therapeutic relationship with your client, but to also be able to hone in those skills to draw your client to want to communicate with you. So let's talk about this a little bit more. When we think of neurogenesis and listening with empathy, again, neurogenesis, this is the birth of our neurons. And that as we practice and as we hone these skills, we are having neural growth. So what can you do to build this and to be able to practice listening with empathy? Well, number one, commit yourself to listening well. Be as fully present as possible. Develop an empathetic listening practice. Put aside your judgment, put aside your own experiences, put aside your values, attitudes, and beliefs, and be as objective as possible. Minimize subjectivity when possible. You also want to engage in active listening activities. So these are going to be activities that can help you to build your ability to develop more effective active listening skills. Many of these activities you will actually learn in the graduate level, and we will do some of this in our class together. You want to resonate with emotions whenever possible. Part of the emotion may be expressed not only through your body posture, language, and behaviors, but also with key phrases like, I hear you, I validate that, wow, that must have been tough. And finally, you want to reflect on the experiences and continue to repeat all of these steps again and again. At times, and I said this before, communication may seem one-sided, but always remember that communication is a two-way street. Messages, not only in what you say, but how you behave, are traveling in both directions at the same time. With your clients, you'll not only be asking questions and hearing their responses, but you'll be looking at their body language, their tone, their reflection, their body language, and that goes into your mental status exam or MSE. As much as you're doing that with your clients are also doing that with you. So please remember that you are modeling behavior for your clients. They are watching you all the time. And you can't not communicate in therapy. The cornerstone of therapy is making sure that we have the ability to communicate with each other. One of the great things that you can do, as I just mentioned, is to model or show your behavior for your client to see. And not only your behavior, but also your communication. This is one of the reasons why you should practice looking like a good listener. And again, we're going to have opportunities to do this in class together. When we think of attending behavior, again, this behavior is the foundation of listening, and it can be positive and negative. And they're boiled down into 4 components: eye contact, body language, vocal qualities, and verbal tracking. Verbal tracking, and we'll start from the bottom up. Verbal tracking is being able to keep up with what your client is saying and your client being able to keep up with what you're saying. If you're asking the client how your day was and your client starts going on about the sale at the local supermarket, some of our verbal tracking may not be on par. So we can use certain phrases to bring our clients back to hopefully talk about how their day has been. Then we have vocal qualities. You want to make sure that in your tone and in how you communicate, that you are doing so in a gentle manner. You don't want to get too loud or too soft. so that your clients can't hear you. And if you do become too loud, that can be seen as a form of aggression and can actually become harmful for your clients. Also, with your body language, you want to make sure that you have an open stance where your shoulders are relaxed, you're sitting back in a chair, you are facing your client, and that can also include things like head nods as they're talking to show that you hear what they're saying, you validate what they're saying, and that you even potentially agree with what they're saying. Some things you don't want to do is have your arms crossed against your body, looking away from your client, looking at your phone in front of your client. That is one of the biggest things that many therapists have done, and it's one of the biggest things that can impact your therapeutic rapport. And finally, you have eye contact, making sure that you are really looking at your client, making as much eye contact as possible. When your eyes move away from your body, up or down, side to side, or completely away from your client, they know. And again, it can impact not only your ability to communicate, but it can impact the therapeutic rapport. And again, eye contact is something that's so important because there are some cultures that believe that eye contact might be different than our culture. So, for example, in Asian and Native American cultures, they view this direct eye contact as aggressive. So it's important with eye contact that we get the understanding from our clients to put them at ease. If you're making eye contact with them, which in many aspects of our culture is important, and their culture dictates that it's not, then maybe finding a neutral object that both people can look at together in order to communicate can be helpful. If you haven't done this and your client consistently looks down, something to think about is in your next session, bring that up. Say, hey, I noticed in our last session together that you had a really difficult time, looking up, or that there were a good portion of the session in which you were looking down towards the ground. I want to make sure that everything is okay. How do you feel about, me bringing this up? Have a frank and honest conversation with your client. Most clients, though, will be comfortable with more eye contact when you're talking and less eye contact when they're talking. But again, this can vary from client to client. And then finally, vocal qualities. Again, your vocal quality, including your tone and inflection, is definitely going to be important, more important than what it is that you're actually saying. And it's often best to match or pace your client's vocal qualities, except if your client is coming in and they are extremely aggressive. At that point, you can model more calming communication. And as you model this, your client is more likely to calm down and be able to communicate more effectively. You can also use your vocal qualities to lead the client, like I just talked about with that modeling exercise. If you have a client that comes in and they are screaming at the top of their lungs, like, this is so dumb, I can't believe I have to do this. Bah! And you say to them, wow, I know coming in here can be really tough, and I'm thankful that you're here today. And the more you keep your tone calm, the more likely they are to come down from being so agitated. And finally, verbal tracking. This is using your words to demonstrate to the client that you're actually and accurately following what they're saying. And this is often by restating or summarizing what the clients have said and using some of their words as well as some of your own words. Body language, huge. And I know I just talked about this, but positive body language is going to be open, being directive towards the client, even leaning towards the client, but you definitely want to be relaxed. Shoulders down and back, your head relaxed. Those are the things that your client looks at. And a lot of this is going to be based on mirroring. This is going to involve matching the client's facial expression and body posture. But again, not only do you match your client at times, but more often than not, your client is going to match you, especially if they're in a heightened state of arousal when they come in. Arousal meaning that they're agitated, frustrated, irritated, angry, etc. Some negative attending behaviors, as I talked about, is turning away from your client, not making eye contact if that's something that they are, attempting to make with you, leaning too far back, folding your arms, crossing your legs away from the client, looking at your phone. These are things that can cause some real issues within the therapeutic relationship, and your client may look at that and think, wow, this person's checked out. Why am I even wasting my time? So, why is non-directive listening also directive? Well, you can't communicate and you can't not influence. So, you do a lot at the same time. Just by paying more attention to some things your client says and less attention to the things that are happening externally can model that behavior for your clients. Your theoretical perspective will also influence what it is that you actually hear. So it's really important that even though you may have a theoretical perspective already or you're working on creating one, that you be as objective as possible and try to hear everything that your client is saying. Your theoretical perspective may guide the future questions in which you will ask of your clients, but if it's something that's concerning your client, they will often come back to that topic. So let's talk about the listening continuum in 3 parts. So the non-directive listening behaviors facilitate client talk. Directive listening behaviors facilitate client insight. And finally, directive action behaviors facilitate client action. So some non-directive listening responses are attending behavior, which we've already covered, therapeutic silence, paraphrasing or reflecting, clarification, reflection of feeling, and summarization. Part of the therapeutic silence, this is where you allow your client to talk and then you don't necessarily respond right away. This gives an opportunity for your clients to formulate an answer on their own without you having to jump in to potentially rescue them. Oftentimes, clients may look to you for answers, but sometimes it's okay for them to come up with an answer on their own, whether it's right or wrong. Them coming up with a solution or an answer and then guiding the questioning process through that can be really helpful. But you also want to make sure that you talk to your clients about silence, because for some people, silence can be very anxiety provoking or can cause internal distress, which you want to try to minimize in your intake. So make sure you talk to them about that. Also, talk about coping with and using silence as an interviewing technique. So as a way to interview, allowing them, even if they can't come up with the answer in 10 seconds, giving them 30 seconds to gather their thoughts and then try to communicate, or gently encouraging them to try to communicate, can be really helpful. So paraphrasing or reflecting is exactly what it means. This is a verbal tracking skill that will have you restate or reword what the client is saying to you. And there are several types of paraphrases. So there's a simple paraphrase. This is a straightforward form of paraphrasing that doesn't add any meaning or direction. It involves rephrasing the core meaning of the client's message. So if your client is talking to you about the awful day that they had at work before they came in today, and they've used the term an awful day, something you might say is, wow, it sounds like your day really was awful, but you still made it to this appointment. That's awesome. Then there's a sensory-based paraphrase. And this is where you embed the client's sensory words into your paraphrase. So part of neurolinguistic programming has these representational systems to refer to visual, auditory, or kinesthetic communication modalities. Simply stated, the sensory-based paraphrase is going to have you talk about the sensory words as you paraphrase. So again, if your client is talking to you about this awful day they had at work, and they talk about how there was so much tension at work that you could feel it, you may communicate and say, wow, that awful day that you had at work, and you still managed to make it to this appointment today. Wow, like that's huge. And the way that you described that tension, I could almost feel it in my body as well. Then you have the metaphorical paraphrase. And this involves using an analogy or a metaphor to capture and summarize a client's core message. So going back to our client who's talking about their awful day at work, and they talk about the tension that they've experienced, you might use something like, wow, you had this awful day at work and it sounds like there was so much tension you could almost cut it with a butter knife, and yet you still made it into this appointment. Wow, that's great, or that's awesome, or that says so much about you and your dedication to becoming the best version of yourself. Intentionally directing paraphrases are paraphrases that can be used to lead clients towards positive interpretations of reality. So you're going to look at the most positive part of the client statement and even add or twist what the client said. So this is what Carl Rogers essentially referred to as paraphrasing with a twist. So again, going back to the client who had the awful day at work, you may say something like, wow, it sounds like you had a really awful day at work and the tension was so great that you could cut it with a butter knife, but you still made it here today. That shows your dedication to bettering yourself and becoming the best version of yourself. I wonder what it would be like 6 weeks from now or a month from now when you have had the ability to still manage these days, but that tension doesn't impact you as much. Finally, there's clarification. And when you look at clarification, this is to clear up any confusion that you might have. So this is where you would state something that they said and then ask something like, am I getting that right? So going back to our example, you may say, wow, it sounds like you had a really awful day at work and the tension was so bad that or so thick that you could cut it with a butter knife. Am I getting that right? When you are reflecting feelings or empathy, this is an emotionally oriented paraphrase, and the purpose is to let clients know that you hear the emotional content of their statement. So an example of this might be, again, going back to our client, wow, it sounds like you had a really tough day at work today and that the tension was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Am I getting that right? Still, with all of that going on and you managed to get here today, that shows your drive towards becoming the best version of yourself and really working through whatever it is that we're going to be working through together. That's amazing. Summarization is to essentially just summarize what they're saying. So you want to keep it informal. You want to be collaborative and involve the client. You want to be supportive and encouraging and include positives or client strengths that might help in dealing with life problems. There's also a pull to reassurance because it's natural to feel the pull to reassure your client and you often want to reassure them. But reassurance and self-disclosure are therapy techniques and should be used intentionally. You don't want to overuse them because then your client might feel like you are just full of woo-woo or that you really aren't hearing them and you're just kind of telling them what they want to hear. We also need to think about some ethical and multicultural considerations. So there's some ethics around not directing clients. So some will prefer more of an authoritative counselor. And again, this is Native Americans and Asian Americans. So it's important if you have those two types of people that you use questioning that is going to be more directive than it is open-ended. You also don't want to do, when it comes to directive types of communication, clients who are in crisis or who have severe mental disorders might require more active and directive interventions. So you might need to be more direct in how you say things rather than kind of letting your client lead it towards their own. If you have useful information, you shouldn't withhold it just to say non-directive. We want to be open and honest with our clients. Let's also talk about gender, culture, and emotion. There's client willingness to tolerate the feeling reflections and is likely based on a mix of cultural, gender, and individual experiences. For example, it might be a lot harder for Black men to be able to express themselves. That doesn't mean that they can't do it. It might be harder for them because for most, and not most, but for many of men who are Black, depending on where they were raised, in the culture, being emotional and letting your emotions out and tapping into your feelings and communicating them can actually be considered a sign of weakness, or it means that you are sissy. So, and sissy is very genderized and it's not an appropriate term, but that's how they may feel. You don't want to hold that against them. And at some point you can provide psychoeducation around it. But in the initial interview, if they're not willing or unable to talk about their feelings or to talk about some of their experiences, just remember that it might be for a number of reasons, including a combination of gender, cultural, and emotional experiences. And values, attitudes, and beliefs in regards to gender, culture, and emotion. So something you might be able to do is use some of the words that they use. So instead of saying angry, you can say bugged. Instead of being guilty, you might say upset. Instead of being angry, you might be frustrated. So pick the words or use the words that they use, or pick words that aren't as clinical. Sometimes you might not know what to say, and guess what? That is a pretty common occurrence. So it's really natural for us to want to have this perfect guide to know exactly what to say every single time because we want to do things right. But guess what? It's okay to not know what you don't know or to not know what to say. It's about being comfortable with the uncertainty and developing humility. This is a central part of becoming a competent clinician, knowing that you sometimes might not know what to say. So finding the ways to kind of work around that and even using different styles of questions towards your clients so that they can help guide you and then you can guide each other down what it is that they really want to focus on. So before we come back to class, I'd love to know from you, what felt most important to you from this chapter? What is it that you want to remember? And how can you apply the ideas from this chapter into your clinical work, whether you are working now or for your future practicum and internship experiences? I hope that this was helpful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email. Also, don't forget, in the comment section below is a question that you can earn extra credit on. All you need to do is answer the question below, take a screenshot of your comment, and upload it online, and you can receive up to 1 point added to your final grade. Remember, it's due by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Until next time, I hope you have a great day and take care.